Today I'm going to make a 5-layer face mask, similar to the video I posted yesterday. This is using the pattern from the website Eat, Pray, Create. And what I'm doing though, instead of using the disposable fabric for the liner, I'm going to make a 5-layer muslin mask. So as you can see, I've pulled out my 1591, which is, because of the direct drive, has the most strength, the most power, a little bit stronger than the white because the white needed a belt adjustment. So I've got it set at 10 stitches per inch, and I just want to show you what it's like to sew through. This is 6 layers of muslin. Now, one thing I want to point out about doing a 5-layer mask, if you cut muslin pieces, 2 pieces for each layer, and you have a total of 10 pieces of fabric, and they all have to be stitched along the front seam to make the mask piece, what you don't want to do is do them all individually. You want to take 6 pieces, which will be the 3 layers for an inner liner, and you want to stitch them all at once. Otherwise, you're going to end up with 5 seam allowances in the front of the mask, which is going to be not only difficult if you want to sew up the front seam top stitch, but bulky. It'll be too bulky. So you have to take essentially 3 sets of pieces and sew through them all at once to make your inner liner piece. Now, I'm also going to make the front and the back lining pieces out of muslin, but you could just use muslin for the 3 layers of lining. Now, you can hear that kind of clunk, clunk, clunk. That is only because it's going through 6 layers of muslin. The machine, there's nothing at all wrong with the machine. That's what it sounds like, going through 6 layers of muslin. Now, because this is going to be a thick seam allowance in the front of the mask, you want to make sure that you trim it and clip it on the curves so that it lies as flat as possible. Now, this is a 1952 Singer 1591 that my dad gave me. Now, in this step, what I'm doing is, instead of stuffing the lining into the body of the mask, I'm going to attach the 3-layer inner lining to the lining fabric that will be against the face, which is what I'm going to call the back. And to do that, as I said in the video yesterday, you want the 2 lining pieces, one has 3 layers and one has 1. You want them wrong sides together, and then you want to pin them. And what is important with doing a 5-layer mask, when you have really 3 different seam allowances, you want to make sure that you've gotten the curves, I was going to say similar, but they have to be more than similar. When you stitch that curve on each of the pattern pieces right here, if you're off at all, this is like piecing a quilt in a lot of ways. Do you see how the 3-layer piece is just slightly shorter right now than the 1-layer piece when you stick out the front? And you just want to be careful that you get all the curves to be equal in their curviness, because if you don't, you could end up with the inner 3 layers being a less defined curve than the rest of the mask, and then it's not going to fit right because your inner lining will be too short. So this piece, when I get this together, this will then be sewn to another piece of muslin, which is really the front, right sides together with the elastic in there. But for right now, what I have to do is make this really a 4-layer lining with just 2 seam allowances. But you have to make sure that your curves, so I have to fiddle with this a little bit because the outer curve is a little bit bigger than the inner curve, and that's going to matter when you go to put the whole thing together at the end. You want that curve to be completely lined up and equal in all your layers. So I've just fixed that just by pulling the front piece here, the single layer, up a little bit further. And now there's no gap, there's no bulkiness. And this is similar to tailoring also. You just want your pieces to fit well together and to fit correctly together. So now I will go ahead and stitch around the edges of this, going through 4 layers total, and I will have a 4-layer liner piece that then just gets used in the pattern from Eat, Pray, Create as the backing or the lining of the mask. Now, one of the reasons I'm doing this is because, well, first of all, I don't mind using disposable fabric for the liner. I think that will work fine. I do have other cottons that I could be making this mask out of, but the cheapest, easiest fabric to get is going to be muslin. So if I can make a 5-layer mask in all muslin, then that eliminates having to buy disposable masks, and all I would have to do is buy muslin. It's just that it takes, I used to get, on my hand-sewn rectangle masks, I could get 9 out of a yard. On these, I think I got 7 or 8 out of a yard, which is now probably going to drop to about 3. So you are using more fabric, but I think that disposable fabric being on the inside won't get into the air. It'll never get contaminated. I think that's fine, and the advantage to that is that it's so thin and it's a bonded fabric. So really what I'm doing today is finding out if muslin is really a substitute for that. Now the 1591 is one of the strongest machines that Singer ever made. It has a direct drive motor, and the machines that are on the market today are just not going to do what these heavy-duty machines can do. They're just not going to do it. I have a brother in the closet, and I wouldn't even think of going through 6 layers of muslin with the brother. It would probably do it, but you're fighting the machine, or you're trying to get it to do it, when with a vintage machine, especially the 1591 or the 201, that doesn't even come into it. And the whole fun part of making your own items, clothes, housewares, you know, house items, is that you don't have to spend all your time worrying about whether your machine can do this or not. So I recommend looking for a 1591. Here are my seam allowances, and this is one spot. This is at the bottom front of the lining part. You want to make sure your seam allowances line up at the bottom. They may move side to side up here, but at the bottom you want them to line up. And you also want to use a consistent seam allowance through the whole thing. Don't let your machine wander all over the place. And right now what I'm doing is using the right hand side of the presser foot as a seam allowance guide. So that's 4 layers of muslin, and as I just said, I don't even have to think about whether or not the machine will go through that, which makes sewing easier. So here is now a 4-layer liner that can be used to finish the mask pattern. And as I said, I'm using the pattern from Eat, Pray, Create, where here's the front one piece, here's the back liner piece, and I will be stitching them together following that pattern by putting the elastic on the inside and following the rest of that pattern. Okay, so here is the mask, and that's really, if you stick your finger in here, you have 1 layer on the front which will face people, and then 4 more layers to get to the inside. Now, even with being careful about the curves, you still have a lot of fabric in here. So actually what I'm going to be doing, because I think it's important to keep this front area supported and stitched. Right now I could put this in the 1591, and after I get the nose bridge in, I could probably stitch on either side of that front seam. I'm going to do that part by hand. So what the next step now, this is essentially a 4-layer mask, I mean a 5-layer mask. But what I'm going to do now is put in the nose bridge area at the top, and then I'll do 2 lines of top stitching, closing this off, and I'll be putting the pleats in. Now look at that, how thick that is. So with that, because that's all seam allowances in there, I'm going to have to move the stitching in, almost, well, half an inch, a little more than half an inch, to secure the pleats. I mean, even the 1591 doesn't want to go through that. And, you know, I have a brother. A friend of mine is doing curtains and bought a little machine, one of those little tiny machines. And I told her if she has a problem with it, she can borrow the brother. And, you know, this is why those little machines do so well. She wanted to start out slowly before having a full-size machine, which in the past would have been a Model 20. You know, I mean, I think modernization has reached the limit of its intelligence, because the machines that are being made today, there's no way they're made as well as these old machines. What she bought doesn't match a Model 20. It's not even about price or economy in that sense. I mean, this machine is from 1952, you know? And so what they're trying to do is sell disposable sewing machines, which is even fine. So that's a marketing thing. The problem is what they're selling isn't as strong as what used to be made. So now I'll do the nose bridge and the top stitching, and I have to say that this absolutely is doable. A 5-layer muslin mask is doable. And then what I'm going to do is hand quilt on either side of the front seam. And then when you do it by hand, you can take your time And all of these little, like, ruffles and stuff, you can just stitch them by hand. There's nothing wrong with doing that. It's a skill that we're probably going to need if our power grid goes out. So when I get it finished, I'll show you a picture of it. Okay, I'm almost done with this mask, and I want to show you something. I've got the pleats in, and I may actually make a longer pleat stitch length because it's so thick the fabric pops up. But the actual pleat stitching keeps it close to your face. I had said I was going to hand quilt the center seam simply because it might be easier than machine. Now this is why, I don't know, in my opinion, probably every household should have a 1591. What I've already started is going on either side of that front seam with the 1591 and machine stitching. And no matter what machine you have and what you're using, what you want to be able to do, you see how I'm holding this, you really have to pull it apart as you do this, because you want the inside seam allowance to be lined up as well as possible as you're stitching this. Now if you get a couple of little wrinkles in the bottom chin area, don't worry about it. There's extra fabric down there because of the curve. So you can see the shape of that, and you have to keep it in that cup shape kind of when you're doing this. So now we have a 5-layer muslin mask with that front area formed. And this is what I was saying. Right now this is kind of flipping this way because of the thickness of the pleats, but once you have that on your ear, that pulls it up against your head. But you could take a hand needle and just run a needle right through here and keep that together at the side if you want. I'm sorry, my camera stopped. I turned the hand wheel by hand and put some machine stitching holding that pleat together. The mask came out wonderfully. 5-layer muslin mask.